We'll finish up Mark 12 this morning. Again, this story, today's text is Mark's final record of a public teaching from Jesus. We'll see in 13 when we get there that he has to say some things to the disciples, but this is his final words in a public gathering in the Gospel of Mark. Now, if you've been with us for a while, this whole section started with Jesus creating some true chaos in the temple. He overturned tables and of the money changers and the merchants and basically called the religious spiritual leaders a gang of thieves, which will not win you any points with the religious leaders. 5 times in either one day or 2 days, the religious leaders have attempted to discredit Jesus, asking him these controversial questions 5 times. 5 times they have failed. The crowds have grown to love Jesus. They have flocked to Jesus. And the religious leaders, pure and simple, want him dead. And so they're trying to discredit Jesus in the eyes of the crowd so they might gain some credibility to be able to take out this kind of renegade rabbi who's claiming to be God. So in this final temple teaching, Jesus contrasts, as we read the text this morning, 2 attitudes in 2 types of people. First, he exposes the religious hypocrisy of the scribes, and then he commends the humble faith of a poor widow. Jesus is not making any friends with the religious, right? I guess he hadn't read the How to Win Friends and Influence People book when it comes to the religious leaders. He is making enemies with the powerful, rich religious leaders, the Sanhedrin in particular, who's this kind of governing board, religious board that worked hand in hand with the Roman Empire. So let's jump back into our text and we'll talk through these 2 different attitudes that Jesus points out here. Verse 38, and in his teaching he said, beware. That's a big word. Beware of the scribes. And here's why we're to pay attention, to beware of them. They like to walk around in long robes. They like greetings in the marketplaces, have the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at the feasts. They devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation, Jesus says. So Jesus uses this big word, beware. We are accustomed to seeing this word maybe when it has to do with some type of ferocious dog that may be behind a fence, right? Beware of the dog. One time, my older brother and I don't know, is Dale even in here this morning? He's probably back with the kids. I was a teenager when this happened. So it's been, 10 years ago? I was a teenager when this happened. Dale and I were out doing some kind of canvassing in this area for the church that we were a part of. And there was this fenced off yard that said, beware the dog. And we looked around and didn't see any dogs. And so Dale had the brilliant idea. It's like, well, I don't think there's any dogs here. I don't see any. Let's just go ahead and go up and leave whatever literature or whatever it was at the door. We'll be okay. And about the time we hit the porch, these 2 German shepherd, snarling, ferocious dogs came around the corner. And we realized that we were in trouble. And so I just jumped off from the porch into a boat that they had they had one of those kind of open carports. I jumped into the boat, and then the dogs took off after Dale running the opposite direction, and so I saw my opportunity. So I jumped out and ran the opposite way, and I could jump pretty high when I was in high school as a basketball player, but never have I jumped so high as in that moment. I ran and literally jumped and cleared a chain link fence, just jumped over it like a hurdle and made it safely into the yard. What it felt like those ferocious dogs just snarling and coming right up behind me to the fence line. I jumped right in time. I wish I had it on video. The video would probably tell a different story. But in my mind, that's how it played out. And so Jesus uses this strong language. Beware. Pay attention. Be on alert. Beware of the scribes. The original language here even carries the idea of staying away from them. Stay away from the scribes. Now, we've said that the scribes are these recognized, authoritative experts. They are the interpreters of the law. And remember, Jesus is standing in the temple. This is their home turf. This is their home base. And you can almost visually see it as Jesus points and says, beware, stay away from those guys. Stay away from the scribes. I mean, he's already like overturned their tables, called them out publicly. So here he stands and publicly denounces the scribes in the home turf of the scribes. And you can also, again, almost visually see Jesus pointing, stay away from the scribes. Beware of the scribes, these experts of the law. They love the spotlight. Do not be like them. They are all about outward appearance and public recognition. And then he gives examples. And again, visually think. Standing in the temple, pointing out. It's not like Jesus calling them to the side into a back closet and saying, let me tell you about these scribes. No, his hearers can visually see what's going on with the scribes. And then Jesus says, here's some examples. They like, right? He uses this language. They desire it. They like to parade around in long robes. Scribes in that day and other religious leaders would wear full-length wool or linen prayer shawls with tassels on the end. I used one of those prayer shawls one time in an illustration here in Mark's Gospel, if you remember that. On the four corners of these prayer shawls would be these long tassels on these four corners. These were kind of, think in your minds, like some blanket-type shroud, right? If you're like my wife and I say blanket, then you can identify. I feel like we got at least, 2 or 3 dozen blankets in our house that she likes to be wrapped up in at different times. Finally, last Christmas, I just got her a shirt that just says, I'm cold 24/7. And that describes her. And so think in your mind kind of this blanket-like shroud. And they wore these kind of open garments so that people would consider them important and consider them superior because they were all about outward appearance. The language that we kind of use in modern churches, they would wear their Sunday best. You ever hear that language growing up? Wear your Sunday best. There's kind of a built-in warning here, maybe against the Sunday best, right? That we shouldn't be about the outward appearance. They're in the temple, they're in the religious building, and Jesus is criticizing them for wearing their Sunday best, okay? That's a whole different sermon we can get into a different time. But Jesus says they like to be known by their outward appearance, by what they are wearing. He also says they like greetings in the marketplace. Very common in that day for these religious leaders to, when they entered into a public space, for the people to rise, to stand up in honor of them. And Jesus says they're spotlight people. They desire to make an impression. They're ego-focused. They like for people to stand and honor them and recognize them. They're all about public recognition. And then Jesus says they desire the best seats in the house, the places of honor. They want the VIP lounge. They want to be recognized. They want the best seats in the synagogue. In a Jewish synagogue that day, there would have been benches at the very front of the room that all the people would face those benches, and they were reserved for persons of rank. And so those scribes would sit in those seats so that people would look at them. A couple of the early churches that I pastor were kind of old school churches with old school buildings with pews and all those things. And I always noticed in those old school churches that they would have you've seen those churches that have the old thrones sitting up on the table for the pastor to sit in before he would get up. It was like the 2 big massive chairs. And I always thought about this verse when I saw those things. Like, I don't want to be sitting in the throne chair on the stage. I'm like one of you. So I caused a little bit of rift in a couple of those churches. Like, I'm not sitting in the throne. Like, just take that thing off the stage. I'm one of you guys. And so Jesus is they always like to sit in the place of honor where they can be seen and recognized. Matter of fact, in that day, if you had a scribe show up to your house party, man, you were considered a person of importance. And so they would do everything they could, the common people, to get scribes to show up at their gatherings so that their own importance and significance would be recognized. These scribes like the VIP attention. And then there's this weird little phrase here, they devoured widows' houses. So scribes lived off the generosity of other people. That's why this idea of them contributing money and the offering was important. Scribes lived off of the offerings of others, the generosity of others. And Roman history, in particular in Jewish history, tells us that scribes would often take advantage of their status and their position to fill their own pockets from the estates of other people and from the gifts of the wealthy and the less fortunate. There's even a very well-known story in early Jewish history of the scribes taking advantage of this poor widow and taking the little bit of money that she had left and putting it in their own pocket. And then Jesus says they love to pray prayers for a pretense. They love praying for show, right? They love to pray with the flowery, old-school King James language when they pray. They love deliberate displays of piety, a desire to be recognized as a pious, spiritual, religious, devoted person. What Jesus is describing is religion that is measured by outward appearance and public recognition. And Jesus exposes them as hypocrites, as charlatans. And Jesus issues a dire warning here, doesn't he? He says there is a greater condemnation awaiting for them. Spiritual charlatans. I have to say that this same warning, greater condemnation, is equally as true today. And as followers of Jesus, we have to be really careful for religious and spiritual charlatans. Like, you don't have to flip through channels very long in religious TV to see spiritual and religious charlatans. People that are all about the outward appearance and the religious pretense and public recognition. And Jesus warns against. Now, it's easy for us to point the finger and say, yeah, that health and wealth preacher on TV, or that guy that's lined his pockets with poor widows sending in their donations. Like, it's easy for us to point the finger. And we should call those things out. Those are against gospel-centered ministries. But what I want us to do is kind of recognize our own tendency toward being this inner scribe that lives inside of us. You see, there's a warning for each of us to beware. Beware, there is a scribe that is lurking inside each of us. And here's what I mean by that. There is a temptation, there's a tendency to measure spirituality, whether it's our own or someone else's, to measure spirituality based on outward appearance and public recognition. There's a tendency for all of us to measure either our own spirituality or someone else's spirituality by these same criteria. It looks different for us because we're not scribes living in first century Judaism. But it's the same concepts. The same concept of public recognition, the same concept of outward appearance, basing spirituality on what we wear or do not wear or how people perceive us. You ever hear this language, he or she's a good Christian? Seems to be a good Christian. Like, we use this type of language, don't we? And we measure those things by kind of outward displays of piety. There is a tendency to define our spirituality by what we do or do not do, by displays of spiritualism, of piety. Do I look the part? There's another text that goes hand in hand with this one that I want to bring to our attention because I think it even gets deeper to the heart of this issue. It's found in Luke chapter 18. Look at the story that Jesus tells here. Luke 18, verse 9. We'll throw this up on the screen for you. He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous. Okay, so get the picture. He's telling this story about people who trust in their own righteousness. Trust in themselves that they were righteous, and yet they treated others with contempt. Here's the story. 2 men went into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. Again, context here, tax collectors were hated. They were considered the ultimate traitor. They were basically Jewish people that gave themselves over to the Roman Empire to collect taxes and cheat their own people out of their money. And so we have a Pharisee and a tax collector in the temple. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus. Here's the pretense prayer. I thank you that I am not like other men. I thank you I'm not like that person. Thank you, God, that I am not like him or her, or I don't behave this way or do that, or that person I see on the news. Like, thank you that I'm not like that person. Extortioners, unjust, adulterers, even this tax collector, he says. Here's the things I do. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. Here's the contrast, 13. But the tax collector, the sinner, standing far off, would not even lift his eyes to heaven, but he beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Here's Jesus' diagnosis of this. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified. This idea of justified is the true righteousness. He went down to his house righteous rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Only one person in this story went home righteous before God. Beware of your inner scribe. Beware of the attitude that says, God, thank you, I'm not like that person. Here's why. Here's why I'm righteous and they're not. Look at what I do. Look at how I talk. Look at what I wear. Look at the places I don't go, the things I don't drink. Like, beware of the inner scribe. In the story in Luke 18, it is the attitude of the sinner to which God responds favorably. And what is the attitude of the sinner? Be merciful to me, sinner. Whoever humbles himself, Jesus says, will be exalted. And this is the attitude that we find in the second scene in Mark chapter 12, the attitude of the poor widow, verse 41. And Jesus sat down opposite the treasury, and he watched the people putting money in the offering box. Many rich people put in large sums. And a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. And he called his disciples to him and said to them, truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the offering box. They all contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. So the scene in Mark's gospel shifts to the temple treasury, where Jesus, interesting enough, is watching people put money in the offering box. Jesus is people watching. And he's watching people put money in the offering box. There was this famous pastor in London. He pastored Westminster Chapel in London back in the first half of the 1900s. His name was G. Campbell Morgan. And one Sunday, G. Campbell Morgan, when the offering plates or containers were being passed, left the stage. And this was a big church for London in the early 1900s. And as they passed the buckets and boxes or plates or whatever they were through the crowd, G. Campbell Morgan walked along and watched what people were putting in, row by row by row by row by row. Imagine what kind of response that got from the people. And G. Campbell Morgan got up on the stage, and this was what he said. Some of you were very concerned that your pastor was watching what you were putting in the offering box. But what I'm here to tell you is that every Sunday, Jesus is watching what you put in the offering box. See the point that he was making? Like, Jesus was watching. And here we see in the story, Jesus was watching. Now, this temple treasury was, if you remember our story, a picture of the temple from a few weeks ago. This was in that court of the women in the Jewish temple, which was the first enclosed section of the temple. Into this area, Jewish men and women and children were allowed. And in this area, there was 13 kind of trumpet-shaped chests in the temple that were used for free will offerings. Kind of a shofar is the old horn in the Old Testament days. It was kind of this trumpet-shaped device, and all these treasury boxes were shaped like a shofar, like a trumpet. I had an awkward experience one time when I was planting preparing to plant a church. I had to go around speaking at a bunch of churches and conferences and was doing that type of thing. And I had spoken at an early morning event, and a lady came up to me after the service, and she was like, Devin, I know you're speaking tonight. Would you come a little early? I want to blow the shofar over you. I said, I don't even know what that means. And the pastor's like, just go with it. I'm like, okay, I'll be there, whatever it was, 5 o'clock. So that night at 5 o'clock, this lady invited me into a room, and she pulled out this trumpet-looking shofar thing, and she had me kneel down, and sure enough, she blew this shofar over me. And you can imagine my response to that. It's like, I just don't know what's going on right now. I was just like, thank you so much for that. I don't know what it's supposed to do or why it happened, but thank you. I guess there's an Old Testament story about the shofar being blown over people. But she was inspired by it, so I was glad that she was inspired. I kind of left there the same as I was before I went into the room. But the shofar blew over me. And so the shofar-shaped treasury boxes were in the temple, and people would put in these offerings. And Jesus said the wealthy were depositing large sums of money into the temple coffers. The temple was a very ornate place, very wealthy, filled with gold and silver. And so all that came from these offerings. Now, let me kind of give you some perspective. The idea, think in terms of the temple as kind of a repository where the wealthy believed they could take their money. It was kind of an investment opportunity for them. And so they kind of had this attitude that a sacred place is a safe place to leave my money. And so it was kind of a safety deposit box in old school days. And so the wealthy would bring large amounts of money, believing that blessings would follow. This is what's important, though. It's not the large sums of money donated by the wealthy that captures the attention of Jesus. It is the minuscule offering of a poor widow who puts in 2 lepta, is the Roman coin, the smallest coin in currency in that day. The 2 coins were the equivalent of an American penny. And it was everything that she had. So there's a couple of directions we can go with this. Here's one I want to just stop and note right now. No matter where you're at in life, no matter how much you have or do not have, no matter how much is in your bank account, no matter how broke you feel as a person, not just financially, but broken at your stage of life, no matter how kind of under the radar you feel or no one notices, or those that do notice are people I do not want to notice, right? No matter what you're going through in your life right now, I want you to hear me. Jesus sees you. He sees where you are. He sees whatever pain you're going through, whatever hurt you're facing. He sees you in your brokenness. He sees you in your woundedness. He sees whatever's going on in your life. You feel like, I don't have anything. I don't know how I'm going to pay the bills next month. I don't have enough to give my kids for Christmas. I'm not sure how we're going to make it next year. My marriage is falling apart. I'm not sure I'm going to have this job next year. Whatever's going on in your life, and you're just feeling the weight and the heaviness of the brokenness of the world we live in, hear me, Jesus sees you. He cares. He loves deeply. He sees a widow giving 2 smallest coins, the equivalent of a single penny. And Jesus sees her. He sees her. To the other casual observers in the temple that day, her offering is insignificant and meaningless, but to Jesus, she has put in more than anyone. The one who has less put in more. Now, how powerful is that word more in this text? She's put in more. Everything about this woman can be described as less. And yet Jesus says, she's put in more. Now, what a powerful word in this text. Everything about her is less. She's looked down upon. I imagine she was mocked for the size of her gift. She's not dressed. All of her dress is less than everyone else, right? What she has to offer, her hygiene, I'm imagining, is less than everyone. What she brings to the table is less than everyone. And yet Jesus says she has put in more. For Jesus, the value of the gift is not determined by the amount given. It is determined by the cost to the giver. Let me repeat that. The value of the gift was not determined by the amount given, but the cost to the person giving. Others gave what they could spare, but she spared nothing. She gave everything. You see, God is less focused on how much we give and more focused, ready for it, on how much we keep. She gave everything. She kept nothing. The value of her gift was not determined by the size of the gift. It was determined by how much she gave, and she gave everything. The text says she gave all that she had to live on. Man, isn't this the defining mark of the kingdom life that we have gone over again and again and again and again through Mark's gospel? All I have is the defining mark of kingdom living. All I have is yours. All I have is yours. It is palms up living. It is total and absolute surrender of everything I am to Jesus. It's why Jesus says, lay down your life, take up your cross, follow me. It is the call of the disciple. All I have is yours. It's yours. It's what we've said week after week. It means to repent and turn to Jesus. That repentance is saying, I'm not in charge of my life anymore. It's all yours, Jesus. All I have is yours. I'm trusting you. It is the call of the disciple. This word for living here, this word for life used in the text, is the word bios. You can see it in our word biology, the study of life. It is that she gives all of her life to Jesus, which means she has to live fully dependent on God. She gives everything to Him, all she had, all of life. Now, if you think the lesson here is about giving or giving a higher percentage of your income, you've missed the point of the text. The point of the text is more about the call of Jesus to give everything in my life to follow Him. Think about it. Man, I was exposed to this truth this week, learning this text, and man, it was just so weighty on me. Think about this. She gave everything she had, listen, to a broken and corrupt religious system. She's in the temple. Jesus has been calling out the temple for weeks, calling out the religious leaders. And this lady gives everything she has to a broken and corrupt religious system, the temple. When we come back to Mark's gospel in chapter 13, the disciples are going to pull Jesus aside and be, Jesus, check out how awesome our temple is. Look at it. Look how beautiful it is. Look at the ornate decorations. Look at the gold and the silver. Jesus, isn't this a magnificent, awesome building? And Jesus says, guess what? Not one stone will be left standing of this building. What is Jesus saying? He's not saying the temple's a bad place. He's saying the whole religious system's coming down. It's being replaced and superseded by the temple. You see, we are not invited to lay down our lives for a religious system or a building or a religious persona. We lay down our lives for a king. And we lay down our lives for a king because he is the one who laid down his life for us. Be merciful to me, a sinner. Be merciful to me, a sinner. Listen to me closely. What God is after is not your wallet. What God is after is you. It's the giver. It's not the gift. It's the giver. What God is after is your heart. Here's the truth about this story. If God has your heart, He has your wallet. If God has your heart, He has your time. If God has your heart, He has your talents. If God has your heart, He has your possessions. If God has your heart, He has your everything. You see, we hear this story and we read this story. And what I've experienced is in my own life and in the life of those I've taught this story to, we hear this story, we read this story, and it rarely changes our giving habits or our lack of giving habits. It rarely does that. Because we just kind of dismiss it as a story Jesus told of the poor widow who gave up everything. And it doesn't really seem relevant to my life and trying to pay my bills and make it through Christmas and all the stuff. I kind of like, this is my money and God's given me this to take care of. And I think that the reason it doesn't change our giving habits when we read or hear this story is because we're missing the primary part of the story. And the primary point of the story is that we fail to give as the widow gave because we fail to recognize the extent of what He has given. We fail to see the extent of His sacrifice. We fail to recognize He gave everything for a sinner like me. Be merciful to me, a sinner. In a season we call Christmas, where giving is spotlighted, where giving is highlighted, maybe what we need to capture the most is our desperate need for Jesus. What we need to capture the most is the prayer of the tax collector, be merciful to me, a sinner. What we need to capture most is the extent of His sacrifice for us. And when we begin to comprehend the depth of our own depravity and the beauty of the gospel and the beauty of what He has done for us and the extent of His sacrifice for us, our response to that is all she had, all he had, all they had, all I have is yours. It's yours. Be merciful to me, a sinner. And when I see myself as the sinner that I am and the extent that He has gone to provide for me, then guess what? I want Him to have it all. I want Him to have my wallet. I want Him to have my possessions. I want Him to have my stuff. It all belongs to Him because of what He has done for me. You see, sacrificial giving is the response of the one who recognizes what He's done for us. So I ask all of us, Ash and I had this conversation last night, like, what is God calling me to sacrifice so that I might prioritize Him? Man, it just seems so trivial when we think in these terms. Like, am I willing to give up Happy Meals for my kids for a month so that I can give sacrificially to Him? Am I willing to give up whatever it is that we enjoy? Am I willing to give up my daily Starbucks so that I can give to the city church Christmas offering? Am I willing to give up one present, 2 presents, 5 presents for my family so that I might prioritize Jesus with my giving? Am I willing to give up all these things that we invest and pour our money into so that we can feel comfortable and convenient? Like, why do we not recognize the extent of sacrificial giving? Why are we not like giving it all up to Him? Why are we not like, I'm going to alter my lifestyle because I'm going to give so much away? Why are we not seeing people that sacrificially give in a way that it changes the way they live life? You know why? Because we don't recognize the depth of our own depravity and the level of His grace and mercy in our lives. Because when we see the gospel at that level, right, our natural response is, it's all yours. It's all yours. I'm spinning my wheels trying to be comfortable in life. Now, let me finish with this. Part of this inner scribe is trying to earn his favor by cleaning ourselves up in order to please Him. If I can somehow stop doing this or start doing this, or somehow I can make these changes or adjustments, or if I can somehow white knuckle it through this season, then God will be more pleased with me. And that's the inner scribe lying to you. Because the gospel says, the gospel message is, be merciful to me, sinner. That's the gospel. Be merciful to me, sinner. It's not cleaning yourself up and trying to figure it out and somehow if I can start doing this, stop doing this, God will be happy with me. He's not pleased with me right now because these things happened last night. If we can recognize the extent of our sin and the extent of His mercy, that's gospel announcement. That's gospel living. And by the way, that's the Christmas story. That's the Christmas story. He came. He came to save sinners. Came to save the tax collector standing in the temple, beating his chest, not even able to look up, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And Jesus said, it is the one who has humbled his heart, who recognizes his sin, who recognizes his need for mercy. That is the one who will be exalted by the God of grace and mercy. It's the God who sits in the temple across from the treasury box and says, I see all this bigness. I see all this wealth. I see all these large sums of money. But let me tell you who I really see. Who I really see is the poor widow giving everything she has. Who humbles himself and drops in the 2 small coins because those 2 small coins represent everything in her life. That's who I see. So I got good news for you today. No matter where you're at in life, the Christmas announcement for you is Jesus came to save sinners. If you're a sinner, you qualify. I think that's pretty much all of us, right? The gospel announcement. And so let's humble our hearts before Him. Let's posture our hearts before Him in this season. And may our heart's cry be, Jesus, be merciful to me, sinner. And guess what? His grace is more than enough for you.